But that is not quite the same thing as calculating the destruction of Iraqi civilians, nor is it the same as an intent to annihilate Iraqis because they are Iraqis. A similar question arose in the 1970s when there was a great deal written by philosophers in response to the Vietnam War. Jean-Paul Sartre argued that the U.S. tactics, such as blanket bombing, the use of napalm, and the systematic burning of villages, amounted to genocide. Hugo Bedeau was sympathetic to the accusation, but in the end refuted it. He argued that however appalling the U.S. policies were, however deliberately and knowingly the atrocities were committed, it could not be shown that this met the specific intent requirement under the Genocide Convention. He concluded with the Scottish verdict, not proven, not quite. It seems that that is the case here as well.
Don't worry, just a jam.
Okay. Not a fire alarm.
No.
Okay.
We're still safe.
Okay.
Just.
So it seems that that's the case here as well, and for that we have good reason to be deeply disappointed in international law. There may not be a crime that could be prosecuted for lack of a venue with jurisdiction and because of the institutional context that authorized the sanctions overall. Yet it seems absolutely clear that the extreme way in which the sanctions were implemented violates the fundamental norms and principles of international human rights law. While international law gives us a framework to judge those acts driven by racial hatred on the model of the Holocaust, it is not adequate to address atrocities that are deliberately implemented by indifferent officials for political or economic purposes. I don't mean to use the term atrocity in a legal sense, as referring to the acts that meet the legal requirements for international crimes such as genocide and crimes against humanity. But I would use atrocity in the ordinary sense, as evoking simply the shock and horror that most would feel in the face of enormous and gratuitous human damage. In the face of such damage, when we hear such rationales as, we believe that if Saddam had equipment to make cheese, he would use it to produce weapons of mass destruction, we are hard-pressed not to disparage these justifications as disingenuous and shameful. It is not that the U.S. government is innocent, but rather that international law fails to account for this kind of culpability. International law has failed us as well, in that it has been possible for an atrocity to be committed by the very body of international authority intended to intervene in the face of atrocities. It is a terrible lack and a terrible risk when the existing framework for international law does not envision the possibility that the very institutions that are charged with responding to these violations could themselves commit them, when it does not envision the possibility that in the name of preventing aggression and threats to the peace, the Security Council could implement a policy that would kill more people than all uses of weapons of mass destruction in the 20th century combined, as was the case here. International governance has also failed us in the way that this occurred, that the structure of the UN and the Security Council permitted a single nation to determine its decisions, and in some cases to override the will of nearly every other member of the Council for years on end. The United States succeeded in using the Security Council first to impose its own agenda in violation of the Council's resolutions and arguably the UN Charter, and then to unilaterally impose its own standard, compromising the basic means to sustain life in an industrialized nation for an entire civilian population. As Hannah Arendt spoke about the bureaucratization of evil, the Iraq sanctions tell us about the legalization of atrocity. It may be that, in the end, there is a particular risk posed to humanity by international governance. As institutions of international governance extend their reach and legitimacy, they also entail the risk of a new form of global violence, not from terrorism or cruelty or racial or ethnic hatred, but rather from the possibility of a single nation hijacking an institution of global governance and substituting its own agenda in place of the interests and will of the international community. U.S. officials did not act with the deliberate cruelty that is envisioned by international human rights law. It was not a hatred that led U.S. officials to act as they did. It was the decision that the Iraqis would bear the cost of the United States' intractable political dilemma. This particular catastrophe did not require actual hatred. It required only the capacity of U.S. officials to believe their own rationales, however implausible they may have been, and that there be no venue in which to challenging their reasoning as casuistic and disingenuous. Madeleine Albright's memorable gaffe, in which she said that the deaths of 500,000 children were worth the price, which she regretted for years, was always and only a public relations error. It made no difference that she and other State Department officials from that point on vigorously insisted that they cared deeply about Iraqi children. The more accurate answer, regardless of the public rhetoric, was, of course it was worth it. Blocking glue, water pipes, water tankers, thermos flasks, ambulance radios, refrigerators, all of this was worth it, because the negligible imaginary possibility that these could be turned to nefarious purposes always outweighed the collapse of the Iraqi health system, outweighed Iraq's frantic efforts to increase agricultural production, outweighed the disappearance of Iraq's middle class, outweighed the hundreds of thousands of tons of untreated sewage that went daily into Iraq's rivers. Those who formulated the U.S. policies were not shallow or ill-educated or coerced, nor driven by hatred or any impulse that we would identify as genocidal. Still, every act implementing this policy was knowing and deliberate, and the consequences were known and recognized, even when they were contained within elaborate denials of responsibility. In 1946, the German philosopher Karl Jaspers wrote in regard to the victors of World War II, "We see the feelings of moral superiority and we are frightened. He who feels absolutely safe from danger is already on the way to fall victim to it. The German fate could provide all others with experience if only they would understand this experience. We are no inferior race. Everywhere people have similar qualities. We may well worry over the victor's self-certainty." Jaspers was right to be worried about moral self-certainty. Above all, this study tells us much about the capacity of anyone, including those acting in the name of human rights and international law, to suspend both rational judgment and the capacity to recognize obvious moral truths when called upon. It's called www.invisiblewar.net. And that has an excerpt from the book. It has links to a lot of my other publications on this. I think the book is really, if this is a field that you're committed to, I think the book would be very useful to you. There's a section on everything that was going on in Congress for 13 years regarding the sanction, on all of the international law issues. And I think no one has been able to document this. I should say that something about my documents, my sources. A lot of some of them are now publicly available, but a lot of them were not for many, many years. So this committee of the Security Council, it met that managed the Iraq sanctions. It met behind closed doors. It had minutes, but the minutes were so restricted that not even most of the members of the committee would get the minutes from their own meetings. But because the minutes and these documents were so restricted, I think the members of the committee came to feel confident that no one would ever know what it was they had said. And so there are these really astonishing exchanges where, for example, the U.S. delegate is blocking all kinds of glue. Glue for books, glue for leather, glue for shoes, glue for paper. And then other members of this committee representing other nations on the council are saying, why are you doing this? What is the reasoning for this? Are you thinking that Iraq is going to glue together weapons of mass destruction? And the American delegate says, do you know the old adage about old horses, when they die, they go to the glue factory? He says, it's because we care about the horses. And you have to think that if they understood that this might be publicly known someday, they would not have been speaking with such candidness. And I ended up accumulating in different ways all of the minutes of these meetings for 13 years and an enormous amount of the other paper that went back and forth, so that it's possible to document exactly who knew what when and exactly who overrode that what the attempts were to reform, to start getting through these terrible bottlenecks. Every time a consultant or a UN agency would say, you've got to get things flowing. Here's how we recommend you do it. And then when there's political pressure that's sufficient, the US would say, all right, we'll agree to these reforms. And then a month later, 2 months later, everyone is saying, well, you said that you would do this, and you're not. And it's just astonishing. Who knew how much when? And the answer is, on the US side and the British side, everyone knew every kind of human damage with enormous, credible, constant documentation. And they overrode every attempt to provide any kind of humanitarian relief for 13 years.